5 strikes in 6 weeks, 27 people dead. US President Donald Trump now says operations may shift to targeting alleged Venezuelan drug traffickers inside the country. He declared, "We are certainly looking at land now because we've got the sea very well under control." Observers say this statement marks a sharp escalation. The administration claims that each targeted vessel carried drug shipments bound for the United States. On that basis, it asserts that it is now engaged in an armed conflict with drug cartels, a status it argues grants the legal authority to carry out lethal actions abroad. But even among US legal scholars, that rationale is deeply contentious. One international law expert cautioned, "The administration's position is they could declare anyone outside the United States a terrorist and unilaterally blow them up with no evidence and no due process. That's a scary thing for any government." In remarks reflecting growing alarm, the expert added, "So hopefully this set of incidents is going to raise some discussion about that and some demand for constraint and restraint on behalf of the administration." In a moment of surprising candor, President Trump also confirmed that he had authorized the CIA to conduct covert operations inside Venezuela. "I authorized for 2 reasons, really. Number 1, they have emptied their prisons into the United States of America. And the other thing are drugs. We have a lot of drugs coming in from Venezuela." The US has a long and complicated history of intervention in Latin America. Mid-20th century precedents include backing right-wing coups in Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and elsewhere, episodes that still resonate in the rhetoric of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. When confronted with Trump's latest remarks, Maduro responded sharply, "No to CIA-orchestrated coup d'etat," which recalled the 30,000 disappeared in the CIA-backed coups against Argentina, the Pinot coup, and the 5,000 young people who were killed or disappeared. How many more CIA coups? Latin America doesn't want them, doesn't need them, and rejects them. Domestic and international critics are now asking whether the US has overstepped legal and moral bounds. Multiple US politicians from both the Republican and Democratic parties have questioned the legality of maritime operations conducted off Venezuela's coast. Maduro, whose legitimacy is already disputed internationally, is moving quickly. He has mobilized his military, police, and civilian militias to defend against what he calls an imminent threat of regime change. Beginning in early September 2025, the US has conducted multiple airstrikes on vessels in the Caribbean that it claims were transporting drugs. The administration describes those vessels as tied to narco-terrorist networks and has used the strikes as justification to reclassify certain traffickers as combatants in an armed conflict. On October 14th, President Trump confirmed a strike on a boat off Venezuela's coast that reportedly killed 6 individuals. He described the victims as narco-terrorists and framed the operation as part of a broader war on trafficking. This marked the 5th such strike in 6 weeks, with the total death toll reaching 27. Earlier in September, the first major strike killed 11 people aboard a vessel allegedly operated by the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. The US had designated Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist group earlier in 2025. No definitive public evidence has yet been released, proving that the vessels were carrying drugs or linking all those killed to criminal networks. Some US officials have described these operations in terms of a non-international armed conflict, a legal category that allows lethal force against non-state groups, such as cartels, under the law of armed conflict. But critics counter that the classification is being used to circumvent traditional constraints, such as judicial review and congressional oversight. The strikes have produced controversy on multiple fronts. Sovereignty, critics argue the US is violating international norms by carrying out lethal operations in and around another sovereign nation. Due process and evidence. With limited public disclosure of evidence linking those targeted to trafficking, some legal scholars say the actions risk becoming extrajudicial. Congressional oversight. Some lawmakers claim the president is bypassing Congress by engaging in hostilities without explicit authorization from the legislative branch. Nicolás Maduro has seized on the historical memory of US intervention in Latin America. His government calls the strikes a thinly veiled effort at regime change. He assailed US motives: no to war in the Caribbean, no to regime change, no to coup d'etat orchestrated by the CIA. Maduro has accused the US of repeating the darker episodes of Latin America's past: forced disappearances, destabilizing military coups, and external interference. In an effort to defend Venezuelan sovereignty, Maduro has ordered broad mobilization. The military, police, and civilian militias are being deployed throughout the country's coasts, schools, hospitals, factories, markets, and in its mountainous interior. He has also scheduled military exercises in Caracas's informal settlements and issued forceful warnings against any foreign incursions. Venezuela has formally appealed to the UN Security Council, requesting a resolution condemning the US strikes as illegal and demanding reaffirmation of state sovereignty. The letter submitted notes that at least 27 individuals have died in attacks on what Venezuela claims were civilian vessels in international waters. Given the US's veto power at the Security Council, a binding response is unlikely. Some recent reports suggest that Venezuelan officials even floated a proposal for Maduro to gradually step down in favor of Vice President Delcy Rodriguez over a 3-year transition. The US reportedly rejected this plan. Venezuelan leaders have denied it publicly, labeling the reports psychological warfare. The scale of the US military presence in the Caribbean has surged. Special operations helicopters, e.g. MH-6 Little Birds and MH-60S, are being deployed near northeastern distances from Venezuela, operating over islands like Trinidad. Additional deployments include B-52 bombers, F-35 jets, surveillance aircraft, warships, and undersea assets. The vessel MV Ocean Trader, modified for special operations, has been observed in the region. The US military has struck at least 5 vessels, resulting in at least 27 fatalities. One recent strike was reported to leave survivors, the first such occurrence, raising further questions about the conduct of these operations. These naval and aerial forces are part of a broader strategic posture. The US is shifting regional leadership from its Southern Command to the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. Meanwhile, Admiral Alvin Halsey, commander of US Southern Command, is set to retire by year-end, amid speculation that tensions over the Caribbean operations influenced the decision. Some analysts warn that while the US appears focused on control of the seas, escalation toward land operations inside Venezuela would risk full conflict, sovereignty violations, and unpredictable escalation. Indeed, President Trump's public remarks about shifting to land targets suggest that the US is preparing new options beyond maritime strikes. Critiques of the strategy are multiplying. At the core is the question of due process. Without transparent evidence, declarations that individuals are terrorists or combatants stretch legal norms. US lawmakers have warned the administration cannot unilaterally assassinate foreign nationals outside declared war zones with no judicial process. Some refer to the approach as dangerously precedent-setting. Another concern is sovereignty and international law. By operating across maritime boundaries and potentially extending to land, the US risks violations of the United Nations Charter and customary norms protecting states from unilateral military intervention. Domestically, critics point out that bypassing Congress undermines constitutional checks and balances. The US Constitution vests war powers in Congress, and any long-term military campaign typically requires authorization. Yet the Trump administration has not sought a formal war declaration tied to Venezuela or the drug cartels. On the diplomatic front, the US faces friction with regional neighbors wary of unilateral US action in Latin America. Many Latin American nations have historically resisted proposals of direct US intervention, and some view recent moves as echoes of past interventionist policies. Venezuela's narrative frames this as an existential threat, defense of sovereignty, national dignity, and resistance to external coercion. Maduro is likely seeking to rally domestic support by casting the US as a new imperial aggressor. The dynamics in play suggest several possible trajectories. Further escalation toward land operations. Given Trump's stated interest in targeting cartels on land, US military planners may be drafting options for incursions into Venezuelan territory or cross-border raids. Intensified legal and congressional pushback. As operations continue, demand for legal accountability and restriction from Congress may grow, particularly from parties concerned about executive overreach. Heightened Venezuelan resistance. Maduro's mobilization of military, police, and militias suggests an aggressive posture, but Venezuela's economic challenges and military capacity constraints may limit their ability to respond beyond symbolic gestures or local disruptions. International diplomatic pressure. Venezuela's appeal to the UN and its allies may generate resolutions, condemnations, or sanctions, though the US veto power in the Security Council reduces the chance of binding action. Negotiated de-escalation. Back-channel diplomacy might try to defuse tensions. Reports of internal proposals for Maduro to relinquish power suggest some Venezuelan factions may seek a political transition, though the US reportedly rejected such proposals. In just a few weeks, the US-Venezuela standoff has shifted from maritime interdiction to a declared covert proxy campaign. The administration frames its actions as counter-narcotics warfare, invoking a new doctrine of lethal authority over foreign actors. Critics warn that such logic, untethered from evidence, due process, and diplomatic constraints, risks becoming a blueprint for unchecked power. President Trump's key statements make the stakes unambiguous. We are certainly looking at land now, and I authorized the CIA inside Venezuela. These lines are not rhetorical flourishes. They telegraph possible expansion into direct military engagement. On the other side, President Maduro's fierce backlash channels both historical memory and nationalist resistance. His insistence, no to coup d'etat orchestrated by the CIA, reflects a deeply felt narrative of regional sovereignty and resistance to external meddling. As warships, drones, and covert operatives chart courses around Venezuelan waters, the central question looms: when does a counter-drug operation cross the threshold into aggression? And who, ultimately, holds governments accountable when lines between war, counter-terrorism, and criminal enforcement blur? Whatever path this confrontation takes next, the human, legal, and political consequences will reach far beyond the Caribbean shores.